There was no alarm clock, no ringing bell, no digital screen to summon the day. For the earliest humans, morning came like a soft breath over the skin, a gradual unfurling of light, warmth, and movement. The first to stir wasn't necessarily the strongest or the eldest, but often the most alert, the most attuned to the shifting rhythm of the earth. Long before words like morning even existed, there was the feeling of it, a subtle change in the air, a thinning of shadows, a low chorus of distant birds weaving into the last scraps of sleep. They didn't sleep on beds, not in any sense we'd recognize. Their resting places were patches of dry earth or hides softened by repeated use, tucked within the natural embrace of caves or shallow depressions beneath outstretched branches. The ground was often hard, the nights cold, and comfort came not from luxury but from proximity. Bodies pressed close, siblings, elders, mates, and children, curled together not from affection alone, but necessity. Warmth was life, and silence, deep and fragile, stretched between breaths, broken only by the occasional rustle, the crackle of embers dying out, or the distant call of a night animal returning to its den. Dreams must have come in raw fragments, faces, firelight, danger, and hunger all merging into drifting images that meant everything and nothing at once. Though they left no journals or stories behind, it's impossible not to imagine that even then, in the early haze of consciousness, they carried echoes of fears and hopes. Perhaps dreams helped them remember where food had once been found, or what path led to water. Perhaps they were more than dreams, messages from within, or signs from something beyond, depending on how the mind made sense of the world. Whatever their meaning, they faded quickly, burned off by the first golden spill of sunlight across stone. As dawn unfurled its light across the forest canopy or rocky hillsides, someone always moved first. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The one who stirred early carried an unspoken responsibility. That rustle of movement, the slow sitting up, the sharp inhale of crisp air, it was more than just the beginning of a new day. It was the silent signal to the rest. It's safe enough to wake now. That first person, whether child or elder, didn't rise alone. Their alertness nudged the rhythm of the group. Eyes blinked open, limbs stretched, breaths deepened. One by one, they emerged from the tangle of shared sleep. The sun was never just a source of light. It was a force, a silent leader, dictating when they moved, when they hunted, when they rested. The angle of the light told them the time far more accurately than any dial could. When the first long shafts pierced the trees, it meant movement. The world was waking, and so must they. The birds, insects, and distant roars or grunts of animals weren't background noise. They were warnings, invitations, reminders. The air itself changed texture, warming slightly, loosening from its nighttime grip. Smells drifted in with the wind, damp earth, crushed leaves, animal musk. Each one a piece of information, processed instinctively. There was no such thing as a lazy morning. Rising slowly meant risk. Danger didn't wait for anyone to stretch and yawn. Eyes scanned the surroundings. Was the fire still burning? Had anything moved in the night? Were tracks visible? Was anything missing? Tools, hides, people? These weren't hypotheticals. They were essential questions that decided survival. The group functioned like an organism, each member a nerve ending in a collective body that twitched and responded as one. Even a child's cry could change everything, sending ripples of tension or urgency through every spine. The youngest were gathered, checked, counted silently with glances and gestures. Mothers carried them with the ease of instinct, never far, always watching. The elders, slower to rise, offered their first murmurs, not speech, but the equivalent of it, a grunt, a hum, a shared glance that said, "We're here again. We made it through the night." That fact alone was something to be grateful for. Not every night guaranteed a dawn. Rainstorms, predators, rival humans, or the chill that crept in without warning, all were real enough threats to make every new morning something sacred. And once the sun lifted fully beyond the trees, once the long shadows shortened and the group had moved from stillness into preparation, the real work of the day began. But that first moment, the collective breath, the slow rise, the cautious scanning of surroundings, was a ritual, even if they didn't know it. It was a moment that had no name, yet defined the rhythm of their lives. In that sliver of time between dream and duty, something deeply human emerged, not in speech, not in planning, but in shared presence. A quiet agreement to move forward, once more, into a world that never promised safety, but always demanded motion. There were no clocks, but there was always time, not measured in hours, but in instincts, when the dew dried, when the birds changed their songs, when the warmth touched the back of your neck instead of your face. These were the signals that shaped their days. In those first fragile minutes after waking, before the search for food or safety resumed, they were not warriors or hunters or mothers. They were simply human, breathing, sensing, waiting together for the world to begin again. Food wasn't a choice. It was the question that hovered over every breath, every step, every decision made from the moment a person opened their eyes. In a world where hunger was a constant shadow, the first act of the day wasn't stretching or talking, it was scanning, not just with the eyes, but with the entire body. The nose searched the wind, the ears strained for rustling leaves, distant hooves, or the chirping of animals that could be prey or competition. Even the soles of their feet read the soil, the dampness of the earth, the faint trace of movement from something that had passed in the night. Food wasn't just something to be consumed. It was something to be hunted, gathered, outwitted, and earned. There was no pantry, no basket of fruit waiting. The morning's first meal was a gamble. If the group had been lucky the day before, there might be something tucked away, roots in a pit, dried meat hanging out of reach of animals, or crushed berries preserved in hollow stones. But more often than not, the answer to hunger came from what the land was willing to offer that very day, and the land was rarely generous. Depending on the season, the options ranged from scarce to desperate. In warmer months, bushes might bear fruit, insects would be plentiful, and small animals stirred early. In colder times, the search became slower, more grueling, and often more dangerous. Men and women moved out in quiet urgency, each group with their own instinctual agenda. The hunters, usually in small clusters, headed toward trails, game paths, or watering holes where tracks hinted at larger creatures. They moved light and fast, often barefoot, weapons in hand. Nothing fancy, just sharpened wood or carved stone tips tied with tendon. Their tools were extensions of their hands, and their silence was not out of stealth, but out of reverence. The animals they tracked could kill them just as easily as feed them. A single misstep wasn't just a failed hunt, it could mean a broken bone, an infection, or the slow fate of the entire group if the injury meant fewer hands bringing food. Meanwhile, the gatherers, more often women and children, spread into the underbrush, memorizing the patterns of edible plants like a living map etched into their minds. What was safe in spring could be bitter in fall. What fed them one year might vanish the next. They watched how animals interacted with plants. If birds ate a berry, it might be safe. If even insects avoided it, best to stay away. Theirs was not the random foraging of the uninformed. It was a generational knowledge, passed by gesture, experience, and careful teaching. A misidentified mushroom could mean days of pain. A missed patch of tubers could mean hunger. Taste, for them, wasn't luxury. It was memory. The sour tang of fermented fruit, the gritty chew of raw root, the metallic flicker of blood on the tongue from a freshly caught animal. These flavors weren't about enjoyment. They were information. If something was bitter, it could be toxic. If something was too sweet, it could spoil quickly. They learned the world through their mouths, testing, cataloging, remembering. Even the smell of a crushed leaf or a disturbed anthill was data. Hunger sharpened every sense. It made the world more vibrant and more dangerous. There were rules too, unspoken but deeply known. If one found a nest of eggs, they didn't take them all. Leave some, or the birds won't return. If someone hunted a large animal, they didn't hoard it. They brought it back to be shared. Selfishness wasn't a trait that lasted long. It either got you exiled or worse, ignored when it was your turn to need help. Sharing wasn't morality, it was survival strategy. Even the act of eating had structure. Elders first, then children, then the rest. Not because of hierarchy for its own sake, but because wisdom and future mattered. An elder's knowledge could save everyone. A child's survival ensured the tribe's future. And still, despite all the strategy and knowledge, there were days when the earth gave nothing. No tracks, no berries, no fish in the stream, just silence and the emptiness that stretched from stomach to sky. On those days, they chewed bark, sucked pebbles to trick the brain, waited for nightfall, and tried not to dream of warmth or fat or the sweetness of honey. Hunger wasn't rare. It was a familiar companion. It didn't mean they were failing. It meant they were still in the game. By mid-morning, if luck had turned their way, the group would reunite, some carrying bloodied hands and meat, others with woven bundles of leaves, roots, or bugs wrapped in folds of hide. There were no plates, no fire yet. They squatted in circles, chewing quietly, letting the rhythm of the day slow just enough to feel that fleeting relief. But the eating was rarely joyful. It was often quick, watchful, ears still listening for threats, eyes still scanning the distance. Even in the act of nourishment, vigilance never left. This first meal, if one could call it that, set the tone. If it was meager, the day would stretch with anxiety. If it was plentiful, spirits might lift, laughter might spark. But nothing was guaranteed. Every bite was borrowed time. And even as the food passed between hands and mouths, plans were already forming for the next hunt, the next search, the next hope for something more. Hunger had no end, but it had rhythm. And in that rhythm, they found the will to keep moving forward. The world outside the cave never slept. Even in moments of stillness, it pulsed with threats, some seen, many only sensed. For early humans, safety was not a background condition. It was the central tension that shaped every decision, every movement, every breath. The goal each day wasn't simply to find food or build tools. It was to avoid becoming prey. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition, learned through loss. In a world without fences, laws, or lights, danger wasn't occasional. It was ambient. Protection began with the land itself. A group didn't settle just anywhere. The choice of shelter was a calculation: visibility versus concealment, water access versus ambush risk, elevation versus exposure to the elements. A shallow cave could be a fortress or a trap. A cluster of boulders might shield from wind, or funnel predators straight in. Those decisions weren't made with maps or theories. They were made through scars, places remembered, patterns observed, quiet stories told with a gesture toward a path and a shake of the head. There, the gesture said, that's where the bear took the child. And so they moved elsewhere. Once shelter was found, the defense never truly ended. There were no walls, no locked doors, so they built what they could from what they had: branches woven into barricades, thorny vines dragged into place, embers banked and coaxed to last through the night, their glow not just warmth, but a warning. Fire, above all, was the invisible guard. Its crackle and scent signaled to some animals that humans were near. It bought time, but it couldn't hold a line. That took vigilance. There were no formal watches, but someone was always awake, not by assignment, by instinct. Light sleepers, the wounded, the anxious, the nursing mother, or the wary elder, each carried a piece of the night's burden. They'd sit near the entrance or stir at every sound. A snap of a twig, the distant call of an animal, the wind changing direction, all of it mattered. And when something was wrong, they didn't shout. A breath held too long, a stillness too still. That's what alerted the rest. Children, even while playing, were trained to freeze at a signal, to drop silent and vanish behind stone or root. Adults kept weapons, crude but effective, within reach at all times. A pointed stick wasn't a toy. It was the thin line between safety and disaster, and every adult knew hesitation could cost lives. You couldn't afford to wonder if a shape in the dark was just a shadow, but not all threats had fur or claws. Other humans posed risks just as grave. Competition for water, shelter, hunting grounds. It turned familiar faces into enemies. Raids weren't myths. They were memories etched into caution. Bones cracked by blunt force, skulls pierced by stone, signs of trauma buried with the dead, all told the same story. The fight for survival often included one's own kind, which meant that even the warmth of a fire could become a beacon for danger. So they learned to sleep lightly, to build nests that could be abandoned in seconds, to recognize the difference between the rustle of wind and the whisper of movement, and most importantly, to trust the unease in their gut. Fear wasn't weakness. It was a tool, perhaps the oldest one of all. It taught them when to stay still, when to run, when to stay together. The burden of that fear fell heaviest on the adults. Children could sleep deeply, could laugh without consequence, but adults carried the weight of what might happen. To be grown meant to be alert, to wake in the night not because you heard something, but because you didn't, because the silence was too complete, too unnatural. because instincts never rested and safety was never permanent. And yet, amid all this tension, they adapted. Fear didn't crush them, it shaped them. It taught cooperation, not out of kindness, but out of shared need. One could not survive alone, and so they stayed close, bodies curled near, ears open, eyes half-lidded, but never fully closed to the world. Safety was never about eliminating danger. That was impossible. It was about narrowing the odds, being ready, sensing the shift before the strike. It was a dance with the wild, one that demanded presence, memory, and an unwavering commitment to vigilance, not because they were brave, but because they had no other choice. No titles, no uniforms, no formal votes or ceremonies. And yet, in the small, breathing circle of early humans, roles emerged with the same quiet certainty as the path of the sun across the sky. It didn't happen all at once. There were no job descriptions carved in stone. But as days turned into seasons and lives intertwined in the effort to survive, each person began to fill a space, not because they chose it, but because it fit. Strength, speed, intuition, memory. These became the qualifications, tested not by interviews, but by outcomes. Who came back with food? Who knew where the safest water was? Who calmed a crying child in the dark? Hunting was never just about brute force. It required patience, reading the land like a second language, tracking movement not just with eyes, but with fingertips against the soil. Those who could feel a shift in wind, who could mimic the calls of animals or disappear into brush, thus became the hunters. Often they were men, not because of a rule, but because years of physical development favored their endurance in long, punishing chases. But that wasn't always the case. Some women tracked better than anyone. Some older men, no longer swift, served as guides, pointing out signs others might miss. The idea of fixed roles was still fluid, shaped more by utility than tradition. Gathering, equally vital, was its own form of mastery. It wasn't just picking berries or digging roots. It was knowing when a plant turned bitter, which leaf cured a fever, which bark repelled insects. It was long hours in the brush, with children clinging to hips, scanning the ground with an eye trained by years of watching others. Those who could remember where food had grown last spring, what fruit turned early after the rains, became living maps, guiding the group's movement. These were often women, but children learned by their sides, and boys who didn't grow into hunters might stay with them, absorbing a different knowledge that could one day save them all. The elders held a different power, not in muscle or speed, but in memory. They remembered patterns, disasters, migrations, seasons of plenty and famine. They didn't give orders, but they were heard. Their warnings might come in the form of a slow shake of the head, a story retold near the fire, a refusal to step toward a certain path. Those who lived long had lived smart. Their presence alone shaped the group's rhythm, offering a kind of silent leadership. In a world without written language, survival depended on memory, and memory lived in wrinkles and worn hands. Children, though protected, were not idle. From the time they could walk, they carried things, copied gestures, ran small errands, or simply watched. They learned without school, mimicking what they saw, tying knots, tasting leaves, throwing stones. Their games were practice, their mistakes sometimes costly. Childhood was short, not because anyone wanted it to be, but because the world demanded usefulness. By the time they reached adolescence, they were already woven into the fabric of the group's survival. There was no adolescence in the modern sense, no years of waiting to become something. You became useful, or you became a burden, and burdens weren't taken lightly. If someone couldn't contribute due to injury, illness, fear, or refusal, the group had to choose, carry the weight, or risk the many for the sake of one. Sometimes they were helped, pulled along, protected. Other times, that the silent understanding settled in that the group must move faster than one person could travel. No dramatics, just the cold edge of reality pressing in. Decisions weren't made by vote or force. They emerged often unspoken. The group moved when the trackers said the animals had moved. They camped when the gatherers saw the signs of good ground. If the elder grumbled and pointed elsewhere, the group reconsidered. There were arguments, of course, but power wasn't held, it flowed. Whoever had the knowledge for the moment led until the moment passed. Leadership was situational, temporary, earned through usefulness. There were no heroes, no single person lifted above the rest. Even those who hunted best or knew the land most intimately still depended on the fire tender, the tool maker, the watchful mother. Pride was a liability. Arrogance could get someone killed. The group functioned not because everyone did the same thing, but because each person did a thing no one else quite could. Together, they weren't a tribe built on hierarchy. They were a system of interlocking needs. And when someone found their role, when a child caught their first rabbit, when a gatherer saved a life with a leaf, when an elder's warning avoided disaster, it wasn't celebrated with ceremony. It was marked with a glance, a nod, a space made around the fire, an acknowledgement that this person now mattered in a new way, that survival had a new thread, that quietly the group had grown stronger. This was not identity in the modern sense. No one asked, "Who am I?" The question was always, what do I give? What do I carry? What do I know? Work wasn't a source of pride or passion. It was the thing between breath and disappearance, the quiet contract between one life and many. And in that raw simplicity, the first society emerged, not through rules, but through rhythm, not through control, but through shared necessity. The decision to hunt was never casual. It didn't begin with a plan or a declaration. It began with a need. When the group's stores were low, when the gatherers returned empty-handed, or when the chill in the air signaled the shift of seasons, a silent agreement would settle among the strongest. It was time to move. The hunters didn't wait for consensus. They read the signs, the faded trail of hooves in dry mud, the stripped bark of low branches, the sudden absence of birdsong. The land whispered, and those who knew how to listen answered with footsteps. They left before the sun climbed too high, before heat or distance drained the body. Their tools were few, sharpened spears made of fire-hardened wood or stone-tipped shafts, weighted clubs, sometimes nets made from twisted sinew or fibers. No weapon was perfect. Each had its moment. A spear could pierce, but only if thrown with force and precision. A club worked only when close enough to see the fear in an animal's eyes. Their hands were as important as the tools they carried. Every movement had to be quiet, every gesture precise, every breath measured. There was no trail, only instinct and memory. The land shifted constantly. What had once been fertile might now be dry. A watering hole could turn to dust. But the hunters watched for signs: fresh droppings, disturbed soil, snapped twigs, and above all, silence. An area too quiet could mean a predator was nearby, or that prey had moved on in fear. Sometimes they followed nothing but the change in the wind, the movement of a single crow, the way insects scattered. They walked for hours, barefoot or in hide-wrapped feet, stepping lightly, not just to stay silent, but to feel the earth, its warmth, its warnings. The terrain demanded their attention. Loose stones could betray a position. Thorned vines could slice into skin and delay a kill. Even a single sneeze, a snapped twig, the clink of stone against stone, could send their quarry fleeing. The stakes weren't just high, they were absolute. A missed opportunity meant more than hunger. It meant shame. It meant another night of children crying, of bones boiled a second time in desperation. Some hunts focused on tracking, following a herd of deer, a lone boar, a group of gazelle-like creatures across plains or through forests. Others relied on traps, pits dug under cover of branches, sharpened stakes hidden beneath leaves, or narrow paths blocked by logs that forced animals into waiting spears. These strategies weren't invented in a day. They were inherited, taught not through diagrams, but through demonstration. One hunter would fail so the next might succeed. Blood, both spilled and lost, was part of the curriculum. Communication was silent. A glance, a hand signal, a low hum barely audible. One wrong move could scatter a herd. One echo too loud could turn a potential kill into a vanished shadow. They moved like shadows themselves, every breath timed with the rhythm of the wild. They crouched in brush, smeared mud on their skin, and masked their scent with crushed leaves. They watched their prey not just with hunger, but with awe. Animals weren't mindless targets. They were smart, cautious, and strong. A single mistake and the hunter could become the hunted. And sometimes nothing worked. The wind would change. The prey would vanish. A sudden downpour would wash away tracks, or the sun would begin to set before a single opportunity arose. In those moments, the silence between the hunters grew heavy, not with anger, but with consequence. They had risked everything: time, energy, exposure, and returned with nothing. The walk back was slower. The woods felt darker. The crunch of leaves underfoot sounded louder than before. They would arrive to expectant faces. Empty hands met with silent nods. No one blamed them. Everyone understood. Tomorrow they would try again. But when the hunt succeeded, when a spear struck true or a trap snapped shut, the response was electric. The adrenaline, the shout held in the throat, the surge of purpose. The kill had to be fast, clean if possible, merciful if not. Blood was not a horror, it was relief, proof of survival. They would gut the animal where it fell, to lighten the load and protect the meat from spoilage. Organs were inspected, prized, sometimes consumed on the spot for warmth and strength. Bones would be carried back as tools. Nothing was wasted, not the hide, not the sinew, not the story of how the kill had happened. Back at the shelter, the return of the hunters was a moment of quiet triumph. No celebration, just the subtle shift from uncertainty to relief. Fire would be stoked, blades would scrape flesh from bone, and the scent of sustenance would rise into the air like hope. That night, the group would sleep deeper, breathe easier, but they knew it would not last. Hunger would return. The trail would dry, and once again, someone would rise in the dim morning, gather their weapons, and step into the unknown, where every branch could be a signal and every step could be the last. They didn't carry spears. Their names weren't carved into bone or painted on cave walls. But while others followed tracks in distant forests or returned bloodied from the hunt, it was the women who stayed, moving not less, but differently. Their world was not bound by distance, but by detail. Their tools weren't blades, but memory. Their work didn't draw attention, but it kept everyone alive. At first light, as the hunters disappeared into the trees, the women set out on their own journeys. Babies tied to their hips with hides, toddlers trailing behind, they moved into the underbrush with quiet purpose. Their world was a network of familiar trails, hidden clearings, and the near invisible signs that only they could read. A bent blade of grass meant recent grazing. A burst of ants revealed a root system worth digging. A wilted leaf spoke of the wrong season, the wrong time. These weren't guesses, they were data, inherited across generations. Their eyes scanned not just for food, but for everything useful. A berry that dulled pain, a flower that soothed burns, a nut that kept through winter. Some plants were bitter, unless boiled, some roots only edible after being buried in ash. This knowledge wasn't written, it was sung, whispered, gestured, tested with trembling caution. Mothers didn't just teach their daughters what to collect. They taught them how to listen, to the wind, to the shift in scent after rain, to the call of certain birds that always seemed to circle above fruitful places. While they foraged, their senses never rested. Every rustle in the grass, every unnatural silence in the trees meant danger. They knew the hiding places, low rock shelves, trees with limbs wide enough to cradle a child. They knew which child to carry and which one to urge forward, which spot to blend into, which call to use to signal others. Their strength wasn't in the kill, but in the escape, in knowing when to vanish, in making sure the children didn't cry, didn't panic, didn't run toward danger. Fear lived in their bodies, but so did control. And they gathered more than food, they gathered time. While hunters might return with a kill once a week, the women brought something back nearly every day. Their baskets, woven from vines or carried in rolled hides, held not just calories, but variety. Leafy greens are rich in what the body craved, fruits when they were in season, protein-rich insects, mushrooms from shaded logs, even honeycomb when they dared to disturb a hive. Their work didn't rely on luck, it relied on consistency. It filled the gaps the hunt could not. Preservation was part of their strategy. They dried herbs on warm stones. They buried roots in cool soil. They wrapped meat in leaves to keep insects away. Leftovers were rare, but when they existed, women turned them into plans. A small stash meant survival if the next day brought nothing. Their wisdom wasn't about the present moment alone. It looked forward, guarded against the unknown, remembered the last drought, the last storm, the last time the river vanished. They healed. When someone limped back from the hunt, it was the women who treated the wound. Boiled bark made a wash. Chewed leaves became poultices. They recognized infection before it spread, knew which plants stilled fever and which ones brought sleep. Their hands weren't just gatherers, they were protectors. They held knowledge that couldn't be seen in stone tools or fire pits, but lived in the survival of every member of the group. And they taught, not with lectures, but with demonstration. A daughter learned the difference between look-alike berries by touch and taste and time. She learned how to bind a cut, how to find water by watching insects, how to test bark for bitterness. Learning was constant. A wrong guess could mean agony. A forgotten step could ruin a whole harvest. But once that knowledge was learned, it became part of her, passed forward without ceremony, but with deep, unshakable importance. Their work didn't leave artifacts. Spears remain, bones remain. The harvests, the medicines, the whispered warnings, they vanish with time, but their impact didn't vanish. They kept the fires burning, the children fed, the bodies mended. They understood the land in ways that weren't always visible, but were always vital. Their intelligence was ecological, emotional, strategic. In a world that measured value by survival, theirs was immeasurable. Without them, the hunters returned to nothing. Without them, the children didn't grow. Without them, the knowledge faded. They were the quiet architects of endurance, the memory keepers, the planners, the protectors in the shadow. And though they left little behind, every life that continued was evidence that they had been there, walking the narrow paths between danger and nourishment, teaching not only how to survive, but how to remain. They didn't have toys, but they played. Not with plastic, not with screens, but with sticks, stones, bones, and imagination sharpened by necessity. Childhood in the Stone Age wasn't protected, prolonged, or padded. It was a narrow bridge suspended between complete dependence and the harsh demand to contribute. And yet, even under the constant shadow of danger, children laughed. They chased each other through tall grass, mimicked the movements of adults, and turned survival into a kind of rehearsal that was equal parts game and training. From the moment they could crawl, children became part of the group's rhythm. A toddler might be strapped to a mother's hip, but they were not shielded from the world. They were in it, breathing the smoke of the fire, tasting bitter leaves, hearing the cries of hunters, feeling the vibration of thunder rolling across the cave walls. Observation was their first education. Words came later, if at all. Long before language, there was mimicry. A child watched how to grip a sharpened stone, watched how to twist a vine into a loop, watched how to crouch when a predator's scent drifted on the wind. They played near the edges of the adult's world, not quite in it, but never apart from it. They rolled stones, tracked ants, made mock spears, and practiced throwing at trees or small animals. These weren't childish distractions, they were simulations. When a child squatted in the grass with a friend, pantomiming a hunt or weaving dry stems into a loose braid, they weren't wasting time. They were rehearsing for life, because the transition from child to contributor could happen in the blink of an eye. No one celebrated birthdays. There were no milestones marked with songs or candles. Growth was measured by usefulness. The first time a child gathered food without being told. The first time they warned the group of an approaching storm. The first time they kept watch while others slept. These moments signaled the shift. Adults might nod. A place might be made near the fire, but there were no speeches, just a quiet acceptance. Now, you are one of us. Children knew danger from the beginning. They saw what happened when someone wandered too far, when a sibling didn't return, when a predator's growl turned into silence. Death wasn't hidden, it was present. But it wasn't explained in metaphors. It was simply part of the landscape. And that knowledge shaped how they moved, how they trusted, how they listened. Their world was not one of padded falls and second chances. A single mistake, a misjudged tree limb, a misread path, a forgotten warning could end everything. Mothers taught their children constantly, without separating learning from living. A daughter learned which berries to avoid by watching her mother hesitate. A son learned to recognize animal tracks because his father pointed once without a word. Lessons weren't recited, they were absorbed. And if a child didn't learn quickly, the group would step in. Aunts, cousins, elders, they all became teachers. Education wasn't a responsibility, it was a survival mechanism, collectively upheld. Games had stakes. A contest of who could throw farther became training for the hunt. A challenge to find a hidden route became a test of memory. A dare to climb a rock face taught balance and boldness. Even teasing and wrestling had purpose, building strength, social bonds, and a sense of pecking order. Laughter was loud, but never careless. Every activity, even the most playful, echoed with the urgency of preparation. And childhood didn't last, not by anyone's choosing, but because the world didn't wait. When a boy could track a small animal, he was expected to hunt. When a girl could identify healing herbs, she was expected to treat wounds. Puberty wasn't a biological event, it was a social shift. One day you were watching. The next, you were being watched, measured, expected, relied upon. Some children didn't make it. The group mourned in silence. There were no graves marked with stones, no lullabies to ease the ache. Loss was constant, but never normalized. It left gaps, noticeable, mourned, but rarely spoken aloud. Grief lived in glances, in the way a mother held her next child tighter, in the quiet hush that fell when someone mentioned a name no longer answered. But those who survived were strong, not just in body, but in spirit. They didn't question their place in the group. They didn't dream of becoming something else. They became what they were taught: alert, useful, durable. Childhood was not an identity. It was a brief window of learning before being folded into the relentless choreography of survival. And yet, within that brief time, there was wonder. A child standing at the mouth of a cave, looking out into a world of shadows and movement, feeling fear, fascination, and freedom all at once. They were not naive, but they were not broken. They carried the fire of the future in their thin arms, wide eyes, and quick feet. And as they grew, as they joined the ranks of hunters, gatherers, fire keepers, and watchful elders, they did so without ceremony, only the quiet knowledge that they had made it. That for now, they had earned their place among those who survived. They didn't have words, but they understood. Before language as we know it took shape, before grammar, before names, before even the concept of speaking, there was still communication. It lived in the muscles of the face, in the twitch of fingers, in the rise of an eyebrow or the stilling of breath. It wasn't speech, it was sense, a shared instinct honed by the need to survive together. And in that silence, a kind of proto-language bloomed, not explosive, not sudden, but slow, steady, and deeply human. A glance could mean stay. A hand pressed low to the ground meant danger. A tilted head and narrowed eyes could signal suspicion. None of this was taught in lessons. It was absorbed. Infants watched the faces of their mothers to learn comfort. Adults read each other's bodies for tension, for trust, for readiness. In the world of early humans, a flinch, A pause, or the direction of someone's gaze could change everything. Gestures ruled the hunt. Words were useless when silence was survival. One clenched fist meant freeze. A circle drawn in the air might mean a herd was near. A hand slicing across the throat was not metaphor, it was directive. Danger now. And yet, these weren't crude signs. They were elegant in their simplicity, perfected by repetition, understood by all. A hunter didn't need to explain himself. One movement said enough. Even sound, though limited, had meaning. A low hum signaled calm. A short, sharp exhale meant attention. Hisses, clicks, and throat vibrations shaped the earliest vocabulary, not of language, but of response. These sounds didn't come from the mouth alone. They came from the chest, the diaphragm, the gut. They weren't planned, they were released. When danger came, people didn't invent new cries. They reached inward and found what had always been there. Facial expressions carried more weight than any spoken sentence. Raised eyebrows, wide eyes, a wrinkled nose. These weren't mere emotions. They were signals. Fear, joy, suspicion, and warning were painted across every face with raw clarity. In a group huddled around a fire or crouched in the brush, one person's shifting expression could alert the rest before a word was ever needed. The group moved as one not because they discussed, but because they perceived. Gratitude, too, had its gesture. A touch to the chest, a bow of the head, a hand placed on another's arm and held just a little longer than needed. These were the earliest thank yous, not transactional, but communal, a silent exchange of trust. No one said, "I owe you," but everyone knew when a life had been saved, when food had been shared, when kindness had cost something. And just as thanks existed without language, so did apology. Averted eyes, a hand extended, a task done without being asked. These became the grammar of early morality. There were sounds of joy, laughter not as we know it, but bursts of breath, high-pitched clicks, rapid exhalations that spread like fire across a circle. A successful hunt might end in such sounds, not to celebrate, but to release tension, to remember that they were still alive. Children played with sound the way they played with stones, experimenting, repeating, mimicking the adults. And through them, language moved forward, step by patient step. Conflict, too, had its language. A low growl, a chest puffed forward, the tightening of the mouth, the stilling of limbs before a strike. These weren't arguments. They were negotiations of space, of dominance, of warning. And if the warning wasn't heeded, the body spoke louder, through motion, through blows. But always, before violence, there was communication, a chance to shift, to retreat, to resolve. Language didn't erupt, it unfolded. Slowly, across generations, those grunts and gestures coiled into patterns. Certain sounds became attached to certain things. A predator, a type of plant, a direction. Repetition turned sounds into markers. Markers turned into meaning. But this didn't happen with ceremony or intent. It happened the way rivers carve stone, with patience, with necessity, with countless tiny repetitions. And it wasn't just about sharing information, it was about shaping identity, the ability to warn, to comfort, to invite or exclude, to name or remain unnamed. It gave early humans not just a tool, but a mirror. Through communication, even without words, they saw themselves reflected in others. They realized they were not alone in their hunger, in their fear, in their joy. The birth of language wasn't a revolution. It was a slow emergence, like smoke rising from embers, like morning fog giving way to day. It rose out of survival, but it carried with it the seeds of something more: memory, connection, story. And though it began without a single spoken word, it would go on to shape everything we are. The fire was more than heat, more than light, more than protection from what waited in the dark. It was the center, the heartbeat of the group, the silent witness to every return, every failure, every survival. When the day folded in on itself and the sky faded from blue to bruise, the fire was already waiting, smoldering in the center of a rough circle, its smoke twisting into the air like a tether between the earth and something higher. By evening, bodies moved toward it instinctively, drawn not only by warmth, but by belonging. The return from the day's work, whether from the hunt, the forage, or the watching of children, was not marked with words of welcome. It was marked by gestures: a hunter dropping a bloodied spear beside the fire, a gatherer placing a leaf-wrapped bundle down gently, like an offering, a mother sliding quietly to the ground, her child asleep across her lap. No one clapped, no one cheered. The fire absorbed it all: the tension, the relief, the silent calculations of what had been gained and what was still needed. The fire had to be tended constantly, not just fed with wood, but guarded. Wind could kill it, rain could smother it, a careless footstep could scatter its embers. Without it, the night returned to what it was before, a place of teeth and cold and blindness. Someone always sat close to it, feeding it sticks, blowing gently to keep the coals alive, watching its edges like watching the breath of a sleeping child. It wasn't a task, it was a duty, sacred in the way that survival always is. And around the fire the first stories began, not as entertainment, not as art, but as memory, as instruction, as a way to carry what had happened so it wouldn't vanish into the silence of the dark. A hunter would mimic the way a boar turned its head. A gatherer would show how a snake curled beneath a certain root. These weren't tales, they were transmissions. And yet, something changed in the telling. Voices rose and fell, faces lit with expression, fingers carved the air with movement. And others listened, not just to learn, but to feel. Fear found its way into these moments, not always openly, sometimes in the way someone stared too long into the trees, sometimes in the sudden hush when a distant sound cracked the stillness. But fear lived there, beside the fire, as familiar as the scent of smoke. It was acknowledged in fragments: a whispered warning, a sharp intake of breath, a glance to the edge of the circle. The fire kept it at bay, but only barely. Everyone knew it was just beyond the reach of the light. And yet, the telling of stories changed that. The moment someone began to speak, to mimic, to act, to reenact, the group leaned in. Children pressed closer. Elders looked up. What was first a recounting of fact became something more: a shape, a rhythm, a memory made communal. The best storytellers didn't just share what happened, they made others feel it. The crack of a branch, the sprint through brush, the lift of a spear. And suddenly, the group wasn't just remembering, they were reliving. From these stories, myths were born, slowly, unknowingly. A great beast too powerful to kill becomes not just a warning, but a spirit. A star that appears before storms becomes not just a sign, but a message. The line between truth and meaning blurred, not because they lied, but because they needed more than facts. They needed explanations. And where knowledge ended, imagination took root. The storyteller became more than a witness. They became a guide through the unknown. Such people held quiet power, not because they commanded, because they connected. They helped others remember where they came from, what they'd survived, who had been lost, and who had endured. And in doing so, they gave shape to the group's identity. A hunter might feed the body, but the storyteller fed something else, something deeper, a sense of being part of something larger than just today. No one crowned these storytellers. They emerged naturally. Sometimes it was the elder with the most memories, sometimes the child who mimicked others too perfectly to ignore, sometimes the quiet one who rarely spoke until the fire burned low and everyone leaned in. What they said wasn't always true in the literal sense, but it was always true in the way that mattered. It explained fear. It gave names to the wind, the animals, the stars. It stitched the days together so they didn't unravel into chaos. As the fire burned lower and bodies leaned against each other, sleep crept in, not all at once, but in waves. A child curled into their mother's side. A hunter slid onto his back, eyes still open. The storyteller's voice grew softer, their words slower, until even they fell silent. And the fire crackled on, glowing in the dark, guarding dreams, and holding the stories that tomorrow would add to. In that quiet, in that glow, the tribe became more than a group of survivors. They became a memory in motion. A people who didn't just live, but remembered. Who didn't just run from the dark, but dared to light it up with fire, with voice, with story. Survival wasn't just about escaping predators or finding food. It was about enduring the quiet war within, the constant struggle against the body's own limits, its fragility, its unpredictable betrayals. Long before the word medicine was ever whispered, people fought for their lives with nothing but instinct, earth, and memory. Every bruise, every fever, every ache was a message, and ignoring it could mean everything would fall apart, because the health of one was never only theirs, it belonged to the group. A limping hunter slowed everyone. A fevered child demanded hands, attention, rest. A wounded gatherer meant fewer roots, fewer hours of searching, fewer meals. The body wasn't private, it was shared. Injury came easily. A misstep on a jagged rock, a twisted ankle in a hidden hole, a branch snapping back into the face. Sometimes the hurt was visible, blood, swelling, a broken limb hanging wrong. Sometimes it was hidden, something internal that stole strength day by day, that left a person gasping at night, eyes wide with pain no one could see. And yet, somehow, they endured. They didn't have bandages from sterile packages, but they had bark to boil, leaves to wrap, ash to cauterize. They chewed certain roots to dull the pain. They spit plant juice into wounds to prevent rot. They held down the injured when bones needed setting, and they used sticks and strips of hide to brace twisted legs and arms. These weren't inventions. They were inherited solutions, sharpened through generations of trial and agony. Someone had once died from the wrong leaf. Someone else lived because their mother remembered the bitter taste that saved her uncle. And so the knowledge passed on, quiet, painful, sacred. There were no doctors, but there were watchers, people who noticed what others missed, who saw the rash before it spread, who heard the breath catch at night, who felt the heat on a forehead and knew it was more than a passing moment. These healers didn't dress the part. They weren't chosen. But when pain came, eyes turned to them. Their fingers knew how to press a wound. Their voices calmed the panicked. They didn't promise survival, but they stood closest to the ones who needed it. Pain was constant. It hummed in the background of every day. Raw fingers, aching backs, teeth rotting slowly with no relief but extraction. Joints that refused to bend with the seasons. Blisters turned to open sores. But they didn't stop for pain. They folded it into their days, wrapped it in silence, learned how to breathe around it, to limp instead of run, to favor one hand over another. If you could move, you did. If you couldn't, you became still and watched, remembered, whispered instructions to the younger ones. Even broken, people found ways to contribute. Sometimes, though, the pain didn't stop. Sometimes the breath grew shallow, the eyes dulled, the skin turned gray. And then decisions had to be made, not by vote, but by reality. Someone too weak to walk might be carried for a time, but not forever. The group moved, the seasons changed, the threats multiplied, and there were moments when the choice wasn't between life and death, but between one life and the safety of many. No rituals, no farewells spoken aloud, just the quiet recognition that this body, this life, had reached its edge. Maybe someone stayed behind, holding a hand, maybe not. Maybe the fire was left burning a little longer, or a song hummed low for the last time. But the group moved forward, carrying the memory, not the body, and with them, the story of how that person had once saved them, fed them, healed them. The past was never forgotten. It was folded into the present, like the scar of a healed wound. Illness wasn't just sickness. It was a test of the entire group. Did they notice in time? Did they protect the others? Did they remember what had worked before? And when they couldn't heal, did they comfort? Did they sit beside the fire quiet, offering presence when they could no longer offer help? Strength wasn't measured in muscle. It was in endurance, in how many nights someone had shaken with fever and still woken up, in how many times a body bent but didn't break, in how much pain someone could carry without letting it harden their eyes. They didn't speak of resilience. They lived it. Every step was uncertain. A splinter could become infection. A chill could become a fever. A fall could become the end. They knew this, not in fear, but in preparation. They learned to read their bodies, to feel when something was off, to respect pain, not ignore it, and to treat every healed wound as proof, not just that they'd survived, but that they still could. In the end, survival wasn't a contest against nature alone. It was a negotiation with the body, a relentless dance with limits, a quiet hope that tomorrow the breath would still come, the limbs would still move, the hands would still carry. And if they did, that was enough. That was victory. They didn't draw for decoration. The lines on the stone walls weren't made to impress, or to pass the time, or to be remembered. They were made because something inside needed to come out, because fear needed form, because questions needed symbols, because silence wasn't enough. In the flicker of firelight, deep within caves where light barely touched the walls, hands stained with ochre, charcoal, or crushed minerals moved with purpose. They drew animals with more life than shadow. They etched marks into stone with rhythms too precise to be random. These were not doodles. They were declarations, prayers, warnings, hopes. No one knows exactly who the first to do it was. A hunter returned empty-handed and marked a bison on the cave wall, not as art, but as invocation. A mother grieving a child traced spirals in the dirt, trying to find meaning where there was none. Someone saw a storm crack the sky and answered not with words, but with a swirl of pigment and breath. Over time, these acts repeated, changed, spread. What began as impulse became ritual. The caves became something more, not just shelter, but sanctuaries, places where the rules of the day no longer applied, where the animals weren't hunted but honored, where the dead were not left behind but remembered, bones placed in circles, stones stacked with care, fire lit not for warmth but for ceremony. There, surrounded by stone and shadow, early humans created something staggering, the idea that not everything could be seen, but still existed. Rituals emerged slowly, stitched together from repetition. A certain rock touched before a hunt, a whisper before sleep. A small object kept hidden, passed from elder to child. No one called it sacred, but it became so because it worked, or because they believed it did. And belief, in a world of uncertainty, was as powerful as proof. When lightning struck, or drought lingered, or birth ended in silence, they needed more than facts. They needed stories, symbols, reasons. The lines on the cave walls weren't just pictures, they were maps of memory, of fear, of imagined worlds. They showed not only what was real, but what was needed to be real. A lion with too many claws, a man with antlers, shapes that looped and twisted like wind or thought. These images told the group, "You are not alone. There is meaning here." And even if no one could explain it, everyone felt it. Fear was the spark, fear of the dark, of disease, of what happened after breath stopped. But it was also the fuel of creativity. When the world grew too large to understand, people made it smaller with symbols. A handprint left on stone became a way to say, "I was here." A smear of red across a boulder became a boundary between now and before. They weren't painting nature, they were painting themselves into it. Some began to carry small objects, stones shaped like animals, bones carved with lines, teeth worn smooth from the rubbing of nervous fingers. These weren't tools, they were reminders of strength, of ancestors, of unseen forces. They didn't have gods, not yet, but they had presence, something in the wind, in the flame, in the eyes of the dying. They didn't need to name it, they just knew it was there. And slowly, someone began to lead these moments, the one who remembered best, the one who listened longest, the one who knew where to place the bones, how to mix the pigment, when to speak and when to wait. This wasn't power, it was trust, a role not chosen, but formed, the first keeper of meaning, the one others turned to when things broke, when the sky changed, when dreams disturbed. These rituals didn't solve everything, but they offered structure, and structure gave comfort. In a world where nothing was guaranteed, where food might vanish, where the river might flood, where a child might not wake, ritual became a rope across chaos. A fire lit the same way each night. A song hummed before leaving the cave. A hand raised to the sky before stepping onto unknown ground. Through these acts, early humans weren't just reacting to life, they were reshaping it, naming it, giving it rhythm. They couldn't control the world, but they could face it together with shared signs, shared stories, and that was enough. Enough to keep walking, enough to keep believing. Belief didn't arrive in thunder, it whispered, in symbols scratched into stone, in footsteps repeated along the same sacred path, in hands touching the same rock before every journey. And from that whisper grew something immense, the first human idea that what cannot be seen might still shape everything. In those hidden caves, beneath layers of soot and silence, the first faith was born, not in gods carved of gold or laws written on tablets, but in the simplest, most human act to reach out into the unknown and make a mark that said, "We are here." Night fell like a slow closing of the world, not suddenly, but with a creeping certainty that swallowed the horizon and softened every edge. There were no lights, no fences, no locks, no soft switch between day and darkness. Only the fire, small, flickering, fragile, marking the boundary between safety and what waited beyond. As the sun slipped below the trees, so did comfort, replaced by something older than words, the deep instinct that night meant danger. The shadows stretched longer, sounds changed, daybirds quieted, night insects chirped with sharper rhythm. The wind, once warm, cooled into a whisper that rustled leaves and crept under hides. In the fading light, every rock became a lurking shape, every rustle a threat. Eyes strained to see, ears reached farther. The group huddled tighter, bodies pressed close not just for warmth, but for reassurance. Shared breath as proof that they were still here, still alive, still many. Children curled into their mothers, not asking questions, only feeling the fear in the way arms tightened around them. Elders stared into the fire, their eyes reflecting memories the others didn't see, and the youngest, not yet burdened by full understanding, drifted off first, their breath evening out while the world beyond their dreams remained unknown. The adults stayed alert longer. One always remained awake, not by decision, but because sleep didn't come easily when you had something to lose. There were no walls. The cave's mouth yawned into blackness. Beyond it, wolves, snakes, insects, other humans. The fire pushed them back for now, but it couldn't stop them. It only made their eyes shine brighter when they watched from the trees. And so, every creak, every gust of wind, every snapping branch sent pulses of alertness through the group. Was it real? Was it memory? Was it dream? They didn't know. But the body responded all the same. And when sleep came, it came like surrender. Dreams weren't stories then. They were sensations, falling, fleeing, remembering. A bison's roar, a child's cry, the flash of a storm. Sometimes dreams brought joy, the taste of honey, the sound of laughter, the heat of sunlight on skin. But more often, they carried weight, unfinished hunts, vanished faces, dangers they couldn't name but felt in their bones. Sleep was never fully restful. It was vulnerable, it was necessary, and it was always, always risky. In the dark, the mind wandered places the feet couldn't follow. It stitched together fragments of the day, fear, hunger, longing, into shapes that didn't have names yet. And through this nightly drift, something ancient began to form, not just memory, but reflection. The quiet stirrings of something like a soul, not in the way future generations would define it, but in the raw, instinctual sense that there was something more inside than just muscle and breath. Those who woke in the night sometimes did so gasping, not because of a sound, but because of a dream, a lost face, a chasing shadow, a fire that wouldn't light, and they would sit up, staring into the embers, reminding themselves that they were still here, still tethered to the world by the slow rhythm of others sleeping. They didn't speak of dreams aloud, not yet, but they remembered. And over time, some began to wonder what the dreams meant. Why some people dreamed of death before it came, why others dreamed of water and then found a stream. The mystery of the mind in sleep became another layer of fear, of reverence, of meaning. Night was not just an absence of light, it was a presence of doubt, of memory, of questions too large to ask while the sun still shone. In that darkness, people didn't just rest, they changed, they softened, they trembled, they reached inward. In the flicker of the fire, when the body finally released its grip on waking, the human mind became something new, more than instinct, more than reaction, something capable of wonder. And then, just when the fear threatened to take root too deep, just when the dreams began to blend too closely with memory, the sky shifted. The black turned to blue. The stars, which had watched silently through the hours, began to fade. A faint glow crept into the world, not fast, not loud, but steady. The first bird called, the wind changed, and with it came breath, movement, hope. One by one, eyes opened. The fire smoldered low, but the worst had passed. The night had not claimed them. The world had not ended. The same faces were still here, the same hands still warm. And with the first steps into the morning light, all the unspoken terror of the night slipped back into the trees, waiting for another dusk. But for now, there was sun, there was light, there was another chance. And so it began again.